Okay, my guess is that some of you are new to this jam. The OG CNFers are like, BO, what's the deal? Why are we seeing a new interview today and not just on your usual Fridays? Here's the deal. Here at CNF Pod HQ, we've partnered with the Atavist Magazine to bring you one extra interview per month, where I interview the Atavist's featured writer and featured piece. Well, I don't interview the featured piece, but we talk about the featured piece for that month. Each month, I'll be joined by Sayward Darby, editor-in-chief of the Atavist, and Jonah Ogles, who's an articles editor there, or both, who knows, to tease out the new piece, and then I'll be interviewing that journalist and unpacking the goodies, no spoilers, to give you, in the CNF Pod feed, something extra, and to give Atavist readers something extra. To deepen the experience of having read one of these blockbuster pieces of journalism that the Atavist churns out each and every month. It's pretty cool stuff. All that said, for those who don't know, I'm Brendan O'Mara. You can head over to BrendanO'Mara.com for show notes and to sign up for my monthly newsletter. Keep the conversation going on social media at Brendan O'Mara or at CNF Pod across the big three. I hope you'll consider subscribing to the show wherever you podcast, because in addition to these monthly Atavist jam sessions, we talk to the best of the best in this little genre of creative nonfiction. So what is it? This is the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, a show where I speak to badass people about the art and craft of telling true stories, and we do things a little different around here. You could say things get a bit heavy. Let's do this. You know, this is exciting. This is like really, really freaking cool. I've got my good friend, Sayward Darby here. How's it going, Sayward?
Hi, I'm doing well. How are you?
Very good, very good. Now, Sayward has been on this podcast twice before. You better go check them out. Why not? She's wicked smart, as I like to say, as we used to say back in the suburbs of Boston, where I grew up. She's the editor-in-chief of the Atavist Magazine, which publishes killer blockbuster pieces once a month. So I figured, why not produce an extra pod a month and partner with Sayward and the Atavist to promote that month's piece and that month's journalist. So before we get to that interview, it's going to be with Scott Eden, as it were. He's been on this podcast before, but I'd like to say, ask Sayward to, can you tell me a little bit about Scott's piece and kind of tease it out a little bit?
Definitely. This piece is a big one. It's about 25,000 words, which is long, but as another editor said to me the other day, it doesn't read like a 25,000 word piece because it's a really smooth read. And the basics are that there were three friends who worked at a gold trading firm in Miami who got wind of a supplier of recently mined gold straight out of the jungles of Peru and could really change their fortunes, frankly, from a business standpoint. Only problem was that he was a known criminal who'd been in prison, had been linked to narcotics trafficking, although unclear whether or not those links existed, but he was somebody who was known to launder money and engage in other illegal activities. So these guys decided to lie about it to their employer so that they could get him on the hook as a supplier. And that led to a boom year in which they made a lot of money off of this guy and his gold. Problem being that gold was illegal gold. It was coming from places where people are not supposed to get gold out of the ground in the rainforests of Peru. Needless to say, some bad stuff happens. Things do not turn out well for everyone. And the nice thing about Scott's piece is that that's one plot line, and there's actually another plot line, which is a bit of a surprise to the reader, I think, in a good way, that is about the history of this region, where the mining takes place, and about a murder that happened in that region of an environmental activist. And Scott, through the piece, there are these two storylines that are kind of circling around each other, and the question is, how are they going to converge? And they do in a really interesting way.
Yeah, and it is such an ambitious, big story, and I wonder if maybe you can give us a little insight into what that moment was like when you read Scott's initial pitch of this story.
I knew Scott's work. I was a fan of, his reporting and writing. I have read his work at ESPN and elsewhere, and I knew that he had been, a finalist for a National Magazine Award. And other editors I know had spoken really highly of him. And when I got the pitch, I was very excited about it, immediately forwarded it to our articles editor, Jonah Ogles, and said, I think this sounds really promising. And I think the thing that I really liked about it was it had these ingredients of being a crime story and a little bit of a legal thriller in its own way. But at the same time, it was really ethically grounded. Scott wanted to make sure that it wasn't just the story of, friends getting in trouble to get rich. It's also about the consequences of that and who's affected by that kind of behavior, specifically in the gold trade. And so that's always important to me, is kind of the standing that a writer is bringing to a piece. Not just do they have a grasp on the facts and, what access do they have, obviously, to, sources and materials and whatnot, but also, like, what is the point of view that they're bringing to this? And I felt really strongly that it would be a good fit for the Atavist.
I don't want to give too much away, but in speaking with Scott, because of COVID and the COVID-related shuffling of prisoners, Scott got to meet and interview a key figure of his very late in the drafting process of this piece. So what was that like when that was kind of dropped in your lap?
Yeah, I mean, COVID actually comes up more than once in this piece. It was 2 years in the making, this story, and from the time of pitching to, the time of publication, more or less. And COVID, I guess unsurprisingly, when it's a pandemic that's affecting, hundreds of millions of people around the world, but it actually affected more than one person in our story. And in the case of the key figure you mean, this person had been in prison and was released under a program to the goal of which is to reduce the spread of COVID in federal prisons. And so in early January, so just a few weeks ago, Scott was able to, he had communicated extensively with this person, but was finally able to meet this person in person, which was great. And as you'll see, he sets a really moving scene of meeting this person and sharing with him some of what he's learned in the course of his reporting. And this person is able to react to it and reflect on it. And I actually think it brings the story together really well. And so, I'm certainly glad this person is healthy and have all sorts of thoughts on what should be happening in prisons with regard to COVID, but strictly from a story standpoint, I think that it wound up kind of being this key ingredient we didn't expect, and so I'm glad it's there.
Nice. Well, this is all such great stuff. So I'm gonna say first, check out Sayward's book, Sisters in Hate. We talked about it a few months ago. Sadly topical again. And second, Sayward, just thanks for stopping by and unpacking a little bit of and teasing a little bit of Scott's work.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to next time.
Fantastic. Well, all right. Well, without further ado, here is my conversation with Scott Eden. So how did you arrive at this piece?
Yeah, man, it's been a long time coming. I arrived at it in a kind of traditional way, like one story leads to another. You're working on one story and you develop sources for it, and they tell you about another story that's intriguing. So I was working on for a piece that eventually was published by ESPN. It was about it's a series of stories that I was doing about Cuban baseball players and how they get smuggled out of Cuba and into the United States in order to play Major League Baseball. And that was a kind of a Miami-focused story. So I introduced myself to develop sources among the Miami criminal defense lawyer, scene, because there were just a lot of lawyers involved in this particular case about Cuban baseball players getting smuggled. So I suddenly had like a big source list of Miami defense attorneys, which is an interesting group.
Yeah.
An interesting pool of sources to have. And one of the lawyers told me about a case she was working on, which had to do with illegal gold mining and gold smuggling and money laundering. And I just started, and this was back in 2017. And the case had just broken at that point, and I sort of just put that, this idea, in the manila folder in my kind of idea file, and didn't really have a chance to get around to it for another couple of years. But then, I thought it would be a great home for this story idea would be the Atavist. Proposed it to him. They gave it the green light and really started the reporting on it in earnest, not until the middle of toward the end of 2019.
I love that the genesis of this story just kind of spurred off of another piece you were working on. And it was one of those things where you're doing this other thing, but the fact that you're doing the legwork, you're out there, boot leather reporting, and then you just hear about these other things as a result of this other thing you're working on, and you just kind of tuck that in your back pocket, and you're like, that sounds cool. Now's not the time, but I'm gonna circle back to that.
Yeah, I mean, I do wish that I would have hit it hard in 2017. I'm kind of, it's I don't know if it's a regret, but yeah, it just so happened that I couldn't really get around to it for another year and a half, which kind of stinks. Because the Miami Herald did a great series on the same case that came out in 2018. So it was a big case. It got a lot of coverage locally there in Miami, and then in the gold business itself, it was kind of a big deal. You're right. One story leads to another. I think all reporters have just an ongoing idea file, and some you get to, and some you do not. And so I guess I should be happy that I even got to this one.
So when essentially the Miami Herald kind of gets the jump in a sense on it and does their own thing, and then so what becomes the challenge for you to then a few years later to bring what you can bring to it, make it new and fresh, so it doesn't feel like you're just regurgitating something that was already done.
Right. I mean, so they did the great a series of stories that kind of about this case, but it kind of branched out just sort of very broadly also into the whole idea of dirty gold. They did a bunch of different stories about that sort of broad subject, one of which was focused on this case. And at that time, they really used the court documents that were available to base their story on, and a lot of great reporting around that. So I guess the thing that I wanted to do was dive deeper into that, into the narrative of what happened by finding essentially a main character to kind of hang the story on and tell the story through. And that's I was able to do that by getting in touch with one of the defendants in the case, a guy by the name of Renato Rodriguez, who was one of these basically salesmen who worked for an American. There was kind of a sprawling gold precious metals company that had its headquarters in Dallas, but they had offices all over the country that bought scrap precious metals, old jewelry from pawn shops, and then they would amalgamate this kind of scrap metal, recycle it, and then resell it to another company. And so these guys opened up an office based in Miami, wherein they would start importing gold from South America. That was their brief. That was their job. That was what they were hired for. And Renato was one of the guys who was involved in that. One of the main fellows. But he eventually, along with two of his very good friends and close colleagues, went to jail for money laundering, prosecuted in federal court in Miami, and I had started a prison correspondence with him, and he became sort of the main character of the story. And I felt like that would be one way to differentiate a story from others that had already been published.
So what are the mechanics behind creating or developing that kind of correspondence with somebody in prison? Like, is it snail mail? Is it email? Like, do you find out who the attorney is and
how does
that work?
Renato's attorney was in fact that criminal defense attorney that I had come to know through the Cuban baseball smuggling case. So she sort of put me in touch with him. And he's in prison. He's in a federal prison camp, which is slightly different than even a minimum security place. So all prisoners though have access to something called Core Links, which is the prison email system. They have to pay for it. It's a private company actually who runs it. But that's how the community, we communicated, and through just regular mail, just regular letters. I, of course, tried to get a prison interview with him, but for some strange reason, it was very difficult actually to arrange a media interview with him. Not really because of anything nefarious or any kind of problem on the Bureau of Prisons side, although it was just sort of red tape, and he kept moving from one prison to another, and so I never got to interview him in a prison setting. And then COVID hit, and when that hit, all visitors were shut down across all the prison system. So we were forced to do the interview basically almost entirely through correspondence, which is the first time I've ever done anything like that. COVID had, it's sort of like, it's all COVID related. COVID had thrown such a wrench into everything, including the reporting of this story because of COVID and the federal the program to sort of ease outbreaks in prisons. He got released into home detention. He's got to wear an ankle bracelet. Renato does. So he was released from prison and is now at home. He has to live at home. He's got an ankle bracelet. He can't go anywhere except to a job. It's almost like an early probation, but anyway, he in Miami. He got released right before Christmas, just this past December, and I had never seen him before. We were only been communicating, like we said, via email and letters. So I flew to Miami. This is another unique thing about this story. Like, it's never happened where I'm actually, going to interview a main source for the first time in person. On the verge of public, after having essentially written the thing. So, I went to Miami and met him, and that became, there's actually two endings to the story, and this became like the first ending of the story. There's kind of an ending and then an epilogue, I guess you could call it. This is such a strange, COVID produced such a strange, like I said, everything's effed up, but it really produced strange things happening in this particular story that had.
Well, let's just say, was it exciting to get this access or this experience, or given the timeline you were in the drafting of the piece, was it like this is overwhelming and complicating what I've already done, all the work I've already done? What was the mindset around this?
Well, the mindset was that it was essential. Like I felt like I couldn't publish this without meeting Renato, in person. So I felt like I had to do it. And we both, Sayward and I both believed that whatever conversation I had, because I kind of wanted to confront him again with all that had happened, and see his reaction. All that he had done, all that he had gone to prison for. I wanted to kind of confront him with that stuff, and just see what see how he reacted. We always felt like whatever happened in that conversation, it would produce material that would be well served to put at the end of the story. And that's exactly what happened.
So as an investigative reporter, and I suspect anybody listening to this who is an investigative reporter, they'll find this question boring, but I'm not. And I suspect there are a lot of people who might, want to be doing the kind of in-depth stuff you're doing, but maybe don't know like how to play those various long games to develop relationships. So what's the process by which that you as an investigative reporter start to engender trust to get people to speak on the record about often very sensitive subjects?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the story, I guess. Just with Renato, he wanted to have his story told. So that was one of his main. He was just motivated to do it. It didn't really take much convincing to get him to speak to me. But I think it's persistence. You just keep going at it. I mean, you keep asking people, and I think too, just being open and not being aggressive. You don't in stories like this. I don't think it's not it's kind of counterproductive to come at people with like a big list of questions right at the start. I think it's better to start in just a really open way. Just I want to hear your story. That's it. Start at the beginning. Start. So you were born when, where,
Yeah.
and you really just start at the absolute beginning, and you not coming in with a big lot of questions, and really assuring the person that you just want to hear their story. There's no agenda at this point. It's so early in the process that you're kind of in this very open information gathering phase where you're just trying to learn what the story is, and the only way you can do that is to ask people to tell their stories.
Yeah, it sounds like you just have to be incredibly patient when it comes to this.
Yeah, I mean, and of course, some people will say no. It doesn't matter how open you are, how much you try, or how persistent, and then you have to respect that too. I wish that there was Renato and his co-defendant. There were two other guys, Juan Granda and Sam Barrage. They said no. And I could not convince them. So I mean, that's totally obviously their right to say no. But so sometimes that open thing does not work.
And when you had access to Renato, is that when you felt confident that you could pitch this story, someplace that you had enough meat on the bone to run with, so long as you had at least access to one of those principal three?
Yeah, I think that was, without that, there would have been no story, for sure. I mean, that's the only way to really tell it in this kind of in the way that an atavist would want the story to be told, which is incredibly detailed and kind of filmic, and with those kinds of details that you can only get if you're, even if it is by correspondence, if you're talking to someone in great depth about what happened to them.
And I think a lot of people certainly in the freelance world and pitching to, whoever or wherever, they're always kind of interested in, the mechanics of pitching and what that might look like. So what did your pitch for this particular story sound like, look like, to get, the people on the other end of it being like, oh, awesome, I really want to know more. Tell me more.
I'm not even sure I'm particularly good at pitching. Sometimes they can be a little long. I think there's the kind of conventional wisdom that you should really keep the pitch, super short, tight, and you don't want to waste editors' time, which is true. I think I'm actually bad at that. But I guess with the pitch, you want to start almost writing what you think the story will be, and you write it in the, you write a lead, essentially, and it's the same mechanics there. If I'm writing the lead to the story itself, you want to keep the reader you want to intrigue the reader immediately, and get them into the story. It's the same thing with the pitch. You start it identically. Now, of course, that means that even for pitching, you've got to do actually quite a bit of reporting already. I mean, some percentage of the reporting for the story needs to be already done in order to pitch well, which is, its own hassle. Time is money. And so you have to, there's no guarantee that the pitch will be assigned. So there's, it's the financial issue is, there are financial issues with doing that. So, I mean, but nonetheless, I mean, the pitch has to be almost, there has to be quite a bit of reporting that goes into it, or you're not going to be able to write that lead that intrigues the editor into assigning the story.
Now this piece took you to Peru. So what was, that experience like, and what about what about your repertorial instincts told you they're like, yeah, this story, I need to be there. I need to go to the source of the gold, so to speak.
Right. I mean, I just felt it was important to lay eyes on all of the places that these guys went in, even just in Lima, and where, their the main character on the Peru side is this guy named Peter Ferrari, who's this sort of incredibly flamboyant character who is kind of a gold tycoon in Peru, an illegal gold tycoon who purchased most of his gold, although not all of it, from a rainforest region in the Peruvian Amazon. So I just felt like I needed to lay eyes on all of those places. The guys from Miami, they actually never went into the rainforests. One of them went to like the jungle kind of capital of that region, but they never really went into the jungles. But I felt like I needed to just even see the mining myself and see what was going to talk to people there. And ultimately, the idea was to kind of weave two narratives together: the story of these guys in Miami, these Americans in Miami, buying the gold from Peru and from this rainforest region, where the mining is almost all of it is illegal because it's in protected rainforest areas.
Yeah, that was something I wanted to ask you about, given the structure of it, because you have the one thread that kind of follows the three guys, Renato being at the spearhead of it, given the access you had. And then there's this other element of it, of a guy with a timber concession that essentially abutted an illegal gold mining operation, and which leads to, a lot of contention. So, how did you arrive at that in your reporting?
I was kind of always in my mind to weave two narratives together: the story of the Miami guys, the story of the business, how gold comes to be introduced into the global kind of financial system, the global economy, and tell the story of how these guys sort of got in way over their heads, dealing with Peter Ferrari, this illegal gold mining tycoon / narco trafficker, money launderer. I wanted to tell that story, but then I wanted to weave in like a narrative of the rainforest mining region, which is called Madre de Dios, Mother of God, in Spanish. That's the name of this region. And then there's then within that kind of province in Peru, there's a place called La Pampa, and that is like there was this sprawling illegal mining area where camps was just totally deforested. Mining camps were set up. And in the kind of buffer zone of a gigantic national preserve there, where it's totally illegal to do any kind of extractive work at all, whether logging or mining. But I wanted to tell a story of that place and how these guys and how the global financial system that wants and craves gold impacts a place like that. And so I was always sort of in my mind to find a story to tell that I could pair with that story of the American guys and the American kind of gold business and the global gold business, really.
And it is such a nasty process by which the gold is extracted, not only from the ground, but once it's in that kind of slurry, mercury is poured into it. And I think somewhere embedded in the symbolism of that is mercury makes you go mad, and this business makes people go mad. So it's just like this very symbolic chemical that is used to extract this element that is so coveted by the first world that it really drives people mad, and it is just such an ugly process.
There's a whole. There's been so much coverage too of this destruction of the rainforest by gold mining, not just in Peru but Colombia, Brazil. It's the gold it has millions of years ago. The Andes, as they erode the river, water has kind of taken the gold that was in the mountains down into these rainforest regions. So they're loaded with gold in these pristine rainforests. So it's not just mercury, but the way that they go about it, which is, first they have to clear cut the rainforest. Then they use this kind of method of placer mining, which is, they use like suction dredges to sort of they use high powered, high pressure hoses to kind of liquefy the forest floor. And then they take that slurry, as you say, and then they come up with like sort of this gruel, and then they dump the mercury in there, and the mercury kind of collects with the gold and weighs it down, and that's how they get the mercury out. But then they just dump it, and it goes into the water table. That's bad just for the people who live there and fish there, and so there's they had to declare a state of emergency in Madre de Dios because people's mercury levels were so high. So it just poisons the food chain, combined with the deforestation. And I wanted to lay eyes on that. So I went to La Pampa and, sort of went with a Peruvian military platoon as they did an interdiction, as they call it, against some illegal miners who were in La Pampa, and they kind of go in, chase the guys away. I mean, it was just insane. The destruction. I mean, it was just a desecration. I mean, it really was kind of terrifying to see it, because we associate rainforests with kind of like these, they're the world's, they're the Earth's lungs, so we without the Amazon, we're toast. So to see it, where it's been like just total kind of desertification of the rainforest it was kind of terrifying in that way, like, because like, my God, we need that place. We can't be knocking it down and clear cutting it. And then there was just trash everywhere. It was like I was like a vision of the collapse of our own civilization to see this place. And I wanted to, once I saw it, I felt like it was important to communicate the kind of shock of that.
Yeah. So yeah, while you're there, what is the feeling under which, or the threats that you felt by being present?
Right. I mean, that is there's only the real danger that one time when we actually did, my photographer and I, and a journalist there, by the name of Manuel Cayo Quispe, who was sort of our guide through meeting people in La Pampa and Madre Dios. But there's really only one time when I felt threatened, and that's when we went and laid eyes on an actual, working illegal mine, which was taking place in a place called an agua hall, which is a protected area of the rainforest, because it's basically like a grove of these kinds of palm trees that are native to Amazonia, and it's totally illegal to do any kind of mining in an agua hall. And we went to one and saw some mining, and they were not pleased that we showed up, and eventually kind of chased us out of there. Although it's a bit of too dramatic for what happened, but there was a machete brandished and some words, and tranquillo, we said as we kind of backed out of there. And then but then there are these stories, though, of and it's not just stories. There in La Pampa, there have been mass graves discovered. There are, what they call the guardians, which is a group of people who have almost like bandits. Some say that they are former Peruvian soldiers who have kind of become mercenaries, and they used to protect coca plantations in the north of Peru, in the northern parts of Peru, but saw that there was a kind of gold boom happening, illegal gold boom happening in Madre Dios, so they kind of migrated down to the gold fields and offered their services, protection services, to the illegal gold miners. But then they became like this, like kind of like an enforcement cartel, and there's any intruders that come into the legal mines, sometimes they disappear, or rival factions, are fighting each other. So it's a violent place for sure. With like I said, mass graves have been discovered.
And then in this piece, of course, there are lots of names and moving parts. So for you, as you're starting to synthesize your drafts, your early drafts, and even your later drafts, what becomes the challenge for you to structure it and keep all these things straight, so we have this beautiful piece that you were able to write?
I mean, outlining, a lot of outlining, and the draft that I turned in actually, we helped me actually redo, reorder some things, but I mean, it takes a lot of thinking beforehand, and actually some storylines had to be cut out to streamline it a bit more. It was actually originally had about one or two other storylines in here that were related to the two main storylines, but it was just too much, so we had to pare that down. But I mean, there's a lot of organizational tools that I use. One is to create a timeline, and I kind of work from the timelines where I just dump everything that I think might be important into this timeline. And then by doing that, you can kind of read through that, and then start circling the most kind of dramatic points in the timeline. Then you know that those are going to be sort of your scenes, and you can kind of have in your mind, how everything is connecting by seeing it in this timeline, and then that becomes really the bones for the story and keeping everything straight.
And do you set that up just in like a Word doc or yeah?
Just a basic Word doc with and then the date and kind of in bold, and then what happened on that date underneath it.
Nice. And I love the ending, not to give anything away, but the final passage of this book is of this story was one of the greater final passages I've read in a long time. It's just such a hammer that just rings. So it just has such a ring to it. And I wonder, at what point in the process of your drafting do you actually come across what will be a good ending, and then you are starting to write towards that, like a lighthouse in the distance?
Sometimes the ending is not clear to me at all when I start writing the story. But in this one, actually, it was much different. I think I knew that this would be the ending when I heard it. So the ending is a sort of an anecdote that one of the main characters told me. So I don't want to give too much away.
Yeah.
But it was an anecdote that I heard in an interview when I was interviewing this main character in Peru. And when the guy was telling it to me, I was like, well, I think that might be the ending of the story. That's the first time that's ever happened, like in an interview, thinking, oh boy, this might be a good ending.
I love when that happens, like when you're just your own internal sort of story antenna comes up. You're like, oh yeah, like from the millions of words I've read and the millions of words I've written, like that has the ring of something I can be writing towards and building towards. It's always nice when that happens.
Well, it's the first time that's happened, and maybe the last. But yes, that was very strange. It was in that way. It was strange to me. I'm like, what? But it worked. Maybe sometimes that doesn't work out, but this did.
Yeah, I've been thinking about beginnings and endings a lot lately, and sometimes I feel like, at the beginning of a story, if you can somehow figure out what the end is going to be before you're done, it's like, okay, that gives you juice to get to the end. And then as you get close to the end, you want to be thinking more about the beginning so you can kind of tie the circle up, and you can actually, like, I don't know, plant a few clues along the way. So it actually, as you get to the end, you're like, oh, this is what I can be backfilling to feed the ending in a way, if that makes any sense.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, you want to set up themes that you then explore, of course, in the story, and then hopefully kind of twist, or there's that kind of turn of the screw that goes just a little bit more. That's kind of a surprising way that you're kind of working with these ideas and themes. I think that's what the ending kind of hopefully does, sort of surprises with you've laid out all of these themes for the reader, but then the ending kind of twists it and takes it further somehow. But yeah, and it should, with the beginnings too. Yeah, you want to set up things that will then echo throughout the story in interesting and surprising ways.
Well, Scott, it's amazing, like what you're able to do. I think it's somewhere around 25,000 words, and it's just an incredible piece that just keeps you asking questions, and you keep going back for the answers, and it delivers on every beat. So I just want to commend you on the work, and thanks for hopping on the show to unpack it a bit.
Always fun to be here. I'm glad you liked it.
Hey, that was pretty cool, right? Whether you read that piece and then listened to the interview or the other way around, I hope you dug that experience. Thanks to Scott Eden for the time and the incredible work he's doing. It's the type of reporting and type of writing he's doing. It's rare, and to be able to look into that brain and how he synthesizes these things is pretty special stuff. I deeply admire him. His new piece lives at magazine.atavist.com. Go check that out. Settle in. It's long, but doesn't read long, if you follow me. That last passage, man, I love a hammer. And that's a hammer. Here in the outro, I usually have some sort of parting shot. But I think for these pods, I might spare you. I don't know yet. I used to put these at the beginning of the show and was, you got to listen to me before you get to the interview, or you got to hit the skip button a few times. I would feel it every time, like in my chest. I would feel these palpitations and the skipped beats, and I was like, someone is skipping through the intro. But in an act of podcastian benevolence, I've moved my riff to the end of the show, and it's usually where I just kind of talk about my work, my writing, what I'm up to, and how I think whatever the hell it is I'm doing might offer you some juice to get the work done. It's not self-congratulatory, but it's kind of bloggy, and with the hope that maybe when you see the bullshit I'm undergoing, maybe you're like, my bullshit isn't so bad, or my bullshit is validated, and I don't feel so alone. That's where this comes from. Well, anyway, you can check out that in, future episodes if you'd like. I'd be honored and thrilled if you subscribed wherever you podcast. It's a creative nonfiction podcast, or Brendan O'Mara, too. I also have a micro podcast called Casualty of Words. It's a writing podcast for people in a hurry. Episodes are usually 2 to 3 minutes at the most. You can become a member at the Patreon community, patreon.com/CNF Pod, where I share transcripts, coaching, the 1K MFA, and grant you exclusive access to the audio literary magazine. The first one came out earlier late last year on the theme isolation. This is the first one. Next one is coming out in June, and the deadline for submissions is March 31st. The theme is summer. Go to BrendanO'Mara.com. The featured post is the submission guidelines. Consider doing that. And if you're a member, it'll help put money in the war chest, so hopefully we can start paying writers down the road and keep producing a dynamite issue upwards of 4 times a year. Next year we're looking to do it twice, year after that 3, and then 4 going onward. But it starts with building a bigger, more robust community through Patreon to help subsidize that. So for as little as 75 cents an episode, it's $4 a month, grants you access to the magazine, transcripts, and some other stuff too, that I just routinely publish on there just willy-nilly, right? Not a bad deal, man. But I gotta say, this was a whole lot of fun. I think we're going to have a good time with the Atavist crew, and of course we're just going to keep this train moving here at CNF Pod HQ. So, in the meantime, that's going to do it. That is going to do it. So, this is how we sign off, all right? Stay cool, CNFers. Stay cool forever. See ya!